This is Why Am I a Mets Fan? A podcast hosted by Samantha Croston and Ashley Wenskoski.
Hello, everybody. What is up? A little midweek extra innings episode of Why Am I a Mets Fan podcast. That's Ashley Wenskoski. I'm Samantha Croston, and we're just going to say it right off the top. We have a huge guest on this week. It's Anthony DiComo. He is one of the MLB beat writers. He writes, of course, for the New York Mets. He's been a Mets beat reporter since 2010. He's been with the MLB for the past 17 years. You also might have seen him as an analyst on SNY. And perhaps most importantly, at least to Ashley, he wrote David Wright's book.
I mean, that's quite important to me, yes. Other than that, yeah, I can't think of a better guy to have on to give us some real inside insight. We always talk about, we can sit here and talk every week, but really he is the guy that is there, boots on the ground, night in and night out in the clubhouse, around the team. So we're so happy to get his opinions on this year's team, this year's season, and as well as some stuff from the past. So I can't think of a better guest that covers the team than Anthony DiComo.
Since the last time we spoke, may as well update you, and I'm sure many of you have seen this already. The Mets won against the Nationals last night 9-7 pro. However, it was a scary ninth inning. I think they went into that inning 9-3, was it?
It was extras.
Yeah,
it
was extras.
Yeah.
It was a scary inning. The bullpen is still struggling, so we're feeling mixed right now. I'm assuming that many of the people who watch this are feeling mixed as well.
Yeah, the Mets, the offense got cooking, 6 runs in the 10th inning. They go up 9-3. JD Martinez hits a big 3-run home run. Jose Iglesias hits a home run. Grimace goes nuts out there. I mean, how about that clip of that kid that was Grimace in the inflatable? It was crazy.
We may or may not have a costume coming to the podcast that soon.
She said may or may not. So yeah, but they pull it out, they win it, but the bullpen's a mess. They just called up, I will say, Jose Butto just got called up from AAA Syracuse a few minutes ago. So I think they're turning to some of those starters to bring in some more bullpen depth, because right now this bullpen without Sean Reed-Foley and without some of those other guys, Edwin Diaz, 4 more games on that suspension, they are depleted and they need some help in this National Series. So hoping to take, I would like 3 out of 4 from the Nationals or a sweep. I'm greedy now, but that's...
We're all able to be greedy in the Grimace era. The point remains right now, the Mets are 3rd place in the NL East, and they are at 500, however you want to slice it. So without further ado, we want to give you that inside insight into the clubhouse, and we have a guy on today who can do that. Here's Anthony DiComo. Everyone, this is Anthony DiComo. So happy to have you here with us. One of the Mets beat reporters since 2010. He's been with MLB for the past 17 years. And also recently, we've been seeing you on SNY too, getting some spots on TV. Happy to have you here with us.
Thanks. Happy to be with you guys.
I guess, we obviously want to start, this is our Why Am I a Mets Fan podcast. We're, of course, in Syracuse, but you have your boots on the ground there, which is why we want to be able to give the people who listen to this that inside access. I'd really love to just start off by knowing what you think makes this year's team different than some of the other teams that you've covered, because there has been a lot of unique things about this year's team.
There has been a lot of unique things, and it's an interesting question, because I would say it's very hard to quantify, and it's not even something that's been around all year long. But I think it goes back to the age-old question of what happens first, chicken or egg? Does winning breed chemistry, or does chemistry breed winning? Because this Mets team has more chemistry, I would say, than any I've covered since probably 2019, the second half of 2019, when they had that young core of position players coming up. That team got along really well. This team is, while there's obviously some different players than we're here the past couple of years, it is largely the same personnel, but the chemistry is different. It's better. And that's why I said it's hard to quantify, because you've got some players who, again, this is all really just dating back to about June 1st, but you've got some players who are doing things and performing in ways that they hadn't previously. And the vibe is just so much different now. Is that because the team just started playing better out of the blue? Or did the team start playing better because the chemistry changed? I can't answer that. I can't tell you if it was Grimace, if it was Jose Iglesias, if it was any of these things. But I can tell you that it's certainly a different vibe than it has been the past couple of years around here.
And that kind of goes to where my next question was going. The Mets are such a unique organization and fan base, because it seems like the fan base latches onto these things. Candelita, Grimace, Jose Iglesias. Just what is it like in terms for you to cover a team that has so many of those funny elements to it, while at the same time, this is a serious, now we're in a wild card race. We're playing some good baseball.
Yeah, it's fun. And look, even when the Mets have gone through some lean years where they haven't been very good, there's always things around here to keep it interesting. People want to say, when things were going bad, people would always want to say LOL Mets and all this. When things are going good, you're right. People latch on to things like Grimace. I think part of it is a credit to it's a team that, the media around it covers it so thoroughly and so well that things that maybe wouldn't have latched on elsewhere latch on here. And once it gets amplified by the media, then it goes even into the clubhouse as well. But again, part of it is a credit to the players in the clubhouse. The manager, Carlos Mendoza, I feel like has not gotten a ton of credit for this, but obviously he's played a role in fostering that type of environment. But yeah, to answer your question, it is fun. When fun things happen, it's fun to cover. As objective as we are in the media, or at least as objective as you try to be, winning breeds some really good stories a lot of the time. And you've seen that throughout the past month here with the Mets.
There is no doubt about it. And you mentioned obviously just how hot they've been since June. I want to know from your standpoint, which players are contributing to that the most, not only on the field, but from a vibe standpoint?
Yeah, well, I guess you have to start with Jose Iglesias, right? I mean, you mentioned him, Candelita. If you're talking about sheer vibes, the fact that the Mets have a player who is also a recording artist who just gave a post-game concert on the field, that's not exactly the type of vibe that you see every day. So he's certainly at the top of the list. And it's interesting because a lot of times some of the best vibes come from younger players. The Mets have had that too with Mark Vientos, with Francisco Alvarez, guys who have come up and made an immediate impact, guys who are getting opportunities in Vientos's case that he wasn't really given the past couple of years. And yet it's Iglesias, a guy certainly on the back end of his career, a veteran who has 15 years in the league, signed a minor league deal at the beginning of this season, who is contributing. It's guys like Francisco Lindor, who's been around a long time, who I think struggled to adapt to a much bigger media market when he went from Cleveland to New York back in 2021, but has learned how to deal with it. Not only just how to deal with it, but has learned to sort of embrace the fact that people, whether he was ready for it or not, look at him as a leader. And a lot of the Mets point to Lindor as the guy who helped spark this when he called the players only team meeting at the end of May after the Mets were, while the Mets were being swept by the Dodgers. So it's not just one guy, to answer your question. It's a combination of things. But I do think once you start getting that atmosphere, it can snowball very easily and more guys sort of latch on, and then it becomes something that really goes out of control in a good way.
You mentioned Mark Vientos and especially Francisco Alvarez, and you've had the unique position of being able to really cover those guys, through their rise and through their little growing up period that we're kind of seeing come to fruition now. Especially both on Vientos, but especially with Francisco Alvarez. He has just been so important to this team this season. We've seen the splits when he is in the lineup versus when he's not. What can you say just about the growth that you've seen from those guys throughout the past 2-3 years?
Yeah, I'll start with Alvarez. I was struck actually last night. We're recording this on a Tuesday, Monday night in Washington. Carlos Mendoza after the game, and Alvarez had an RBI double, an RBI triple, and Carlos Mendoza was asked quite a few questions about him and referred to Alvarez as kind of the heart and soul of this team, which is certainly not something you hear every day about a 22-year-old who, by the way, is still one of the youngest players in the major leagues right now. But then you tack on the fact that this is a team with a lot of veterans on it. Lindor, JD Martinez, Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, going down the line. And not to take anything away from those guys and their leadership and their vibes and all that stuff. But the fact that Alvarez has commanded this sort of respect from people inside that room, I think speaks volumes about who he is and what he brings to the table. He's kind of a pure soul in that he is really just about the winning. And as much as you like to pretend that everyone's that way, they're really not. So I would say Alvarez is very unique in that regard. And he's also a guy that just continues to put the work in and get better. There were serious questions about his defense when he first came up. There were serious questions, when he was a rookie about his ability to hit major league pitching on a consistent basis. He continues to work. He continues to answer those things. Vientos, I would put in a different bucket. Vientos is a guy who, unlike Alvarez, was not a quote unquote can't miss prospect. And I would say he was jerked around a little bit when he first came up. Wasn't given regular at bats, kept coming up and down from the minor leagues, but he was given a real runway here for one of the first times in his career, starting at the end of May. And I think there was a lot of curiosity, especially amongst the fan base, about what it could look like if this guy got exactly that, playing time every single day. And he has absolutely run with it. He's one of those sort of keep it simple guys, see the ball, hit the ball, but he's got as much raw power as anyone in the game. And turns out, if you give him everyday playing time, it looks pretty good.
It looks very good. And, you also even mentioned Carlos Mendoza, saying that you don't necessarily feel he's gotten as much credit as he maybe deserves. I guess I want to know what has impressed you about him compared to other managers that you've covered.
Well, you got to start with the fact that over the past 5 or 6 years, I mean, how many managers have the Mets run through? From Mickey Callaway to Carlos Beltran to Luis Rojas to Buck Showalter, it has been an absolute revolving door. And look, things could still go south for the Mets. I'm not ready to crown Carlos Mendoza as the long-term answer in Flushing, but everything I see from him is exactly what you would hope from a manager. He is positive, but also a realist. He is experienced, and yet, despite having no big league managerial experience coming into this, he certainly walks and acts like a guy who has done it before. He's not afraid to make hard decisions, which you've seen in terms of some of the personnel moves that he and David Stearns, the president of baseball operations, have made. He definitely does not carry himself like a rookie manager. He's not afraid. So these are, again, all unmeasurable things. These are all kind of anecdotal things, but I see the way he walks around the clubhouse. I see the way he interacts with players. I see the way he interacts with those of us in the media. And I think the ingredients are there for him to be a really successful manager. Now, look, you have to have more than just a good manager for this to work. And I would say there's probably more people capable of being good managers out there than have ultimately done it, because you have to have the roster to do it. You have to have the team to do it. But with this Mets team and this ownership and their desire to win, I think the ingredients are there for Carlos Mendoza. I think he has the aptitude to do it. So, yeah, I think it's funny when things go poorly. And this isn't unique to the Mets. This is everywhere. When things go poorly, the manager tends to get an outsized share of the blame. When things go well, I think the credit largely goes to the players and maybe a little bit to the front office. But Carlos Mendoza, I do believe, deserves some of that credit as well.
The ownership group is something that Mets fans are so excited about. Steve Cohen, and then obviously bringing in David Stearns. And while fans are excited about it, I think it's probably the most elusive part of this team to many of your casual fans or even people who watch every night. You just don't get to see those guys very often. So from your perspective, someone who gets to be around the team, gets to be around David Stearns when he does those press conferences at the beginning of a homestand, just what can you say about your impression on David Stearns and on where Steve Cohen is leading this ship?
Yeah, I think they are professionals. I think David Stearns is a guy who very much knows what he's doing. He's done it before. People want to paint him as this type of savant who knows and does things that other GMs can't. I'm not sure if that's true. We'll see when all push comes to shove, how this ultimately turns out. But I think when you get a smart president of baseball operations, and David Stearns is undeniably that, and you give him the type of resources that Steve Cohen is very clearly willing to spend, it's a combination that breeds success. And as long as you're not making major mistakes as the president of baseball operations in that position, over the long haul, over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you're probably going to experience some success. Remember, coming into 2024, this was not a year that the Mets were looking at as, okay, playoffs or bust. This was more of a reset year. I think what the Mets have done in June has started to change that narrative. And as long as they continue this and are even within spitting distance of 500 heading into the trade deadline in a few weeks, I think it's going to be very interesting to see where David Stearns goes, because he's not going to want to sacrifice the future. And yet this is a team that deserves, I think, some help, especially in the bullpen. So we'll see where the Mets go. We'll see what the Mets do. We'll see what David Stearns looks like, what his body of work looks like over more time. But like I said, when you combine that sort of acumen, a guy who's had a lot of success in the past, who clearly knows what he's doing with the resources of ownership, it can be a pretty potent combination.
And you mentioned what to do at that deadline. We pretty much talk about it every week at this point, and we say it must be tough for, the decision makers, the people who have to figure this out. But from where you're standing, do you think they should buy or sell or something else in between?
I certainly don't think they should sell. And thankfully, unless, for the Mets, unless things really crash and burn here over the first few weeks of July, I no longer envision a scenario where you're trading Luis Severino, you're trading JD Martinez, you're trading Pete Alonso. It's hard to do that and say, hey, we're going to be a competitive team. I also don't necessarily think the Mets should aggressively buy. I don't know if this is the type of roster that you want to go all in on and sacrifice, some of the good things you have coming up in 2025 and 2026. But there is a very reasonable and pretty wide middle ground, I would say, where you shore up the bullpen with a couple of arms. And really, that's the big thing for me, is that bullpen, because I think you can certainly get by with what you have in the rotation. I think the lineup has been objectively the best in the league over the past 5 weeks or so. So I think at the very least, this team deserves a couple more relievers. They have a couple guys who are out for the year. And if you can do that and turn this bullpen back into what you thought it was on opening day, with Edwin, Diaz, and a couple strong setup men and some depth there, then I think this whole picture looks a lot different than it does right now. Right now, the Mets are just sort of bludgeoning teams with their offense and hoping they can survive at the end of the games. If they can change that last part, you could be looking at a very interesting team heading into the late season.
You have covered this game for so many years, and you've covered it through a little bit of a change in the playoff picture, right? There didn't used to be this third wild card. And with the third wild card, it's brought about, it means so many more teams are in contention come June and July, right? The Mets are 500 right now, and we're sitting here talking about a possible playoff berth. So I just want to get from your perspective, as someone who's been around the league for years, I guess that change and that shift has meant that there's a lot more parity around the league with teams that are not necessarily in either bucket. They're not solely in contention. They're not solely out of the picture. Just what is that third wild card? How has that changed the feeling around the midsummer in the game?
Yeah, a lot. If you look at the National League right now, there's really 13 teams that can tell themselves out of 15. They can tell themselves, hey, we're right there. We're within a few games of a wild card spot. So a team like the Mets is obviously one of them, and can say, well, wait, we're right there too. And we have resources where we can maybe outspend at the deadline or take on contracts, do some things that other clubs can't. But yeah, it has created more parity. It's created fewer sellers where the market is really different. You look at a team like the White Sox, basically every major player that might get traded at this deadline, or seemingly close to it, is on the Chicago White Sox right now, because they're one of the few teams that is not in it and that has interesting talent. It definitely has changed the dynamics of the trade deadline, in which you have fewer clear sellers, more teams that aren't really sure what they're doing and want to take it as far into July as they can before deciding, and also more teams that think they have the type of roster that they can go for it. And so it's created more competition for those few pieces that are out there that you can buy. I will say, luckily for the Mets, given that their clear and obvious need at the trade deadline is bullpen help, that is always the easiest thing to find. There's 8 relievers on every team. And even some of the bad teams in the league have some pretty decent relievers in their bullpen. So they're not in a spot where they have to go out and get a starting pitcher. They're not in the spot where they have to go out and get a big bat. It makes things definitely easier for David Stearns heading into, as you mentioned, is a good question, a complicated deadline with those extra playoff spots.
You obviously mentioned bullpen help. I think it's worth mentioning and just getting your opinion on the entire Edwin Diaz situation, and also how Carlos Mendoza handled it.
Yeah, look, it's certainly not something that you want as the manager of the team. I think the Mets were very quick to just say, okay, let's move beyond this. And look, I can't sit here and tell you if Edwin Diaz was being truthful, if he used something illegal, if he didn't use something illegal. He knows that. Maybe Carlos Mendoza knows that. Maybe he doesn't. But the Mets were certainly not voracious in their defense. There was no ranting and raving on the field. Diaz accepted his suspension without appeal. And the vibe that I got as soon as that happened was kind of like, it's done. Let's move on. And it became this challenge for the team. How do we piece together a bullpen for 10 games with not just without him, but without Brooks Raley, Drew Smith, who are both almost certainly done for the season. Sean Reed-Foley's on the IL. So the Mets are missing a bunch of pieces, and you've seen them over the past few days just cycling in and out relievers, literally just trying to get guys to pitch. Whether or not, I would hope that Edwin Diaz, regardless of whether or not he's guilty, feels bad for having created a situation in which the Mets have to do that. And you would hope that it doesn't happen again. It's happened 3 times to the Mets now in the past 3 seasons with Max Scherzer, Drew Smith, and now Edwin Diaz. It's not great. It hurts the team quite a bit when you have to play shorthanded in a bullpen, especially these days when starters are going shorter and shorter. So the Mets will be very happy this weekend when they get Edwin Diaz back.
Absolutely. And overarching picture for this team this year, you mentioned it right off the top when we started talking that this team does have a little bit of a different feel to it. Maybe one we haven't seen since 2019, winning we haven't seen, especially since 2022. What is your ceiling for this team this year? And right now here on July 2nd, what would you feel comfortable saying? Do you think this success is sustainable for them throughout the rest of the season?
I do. So for all the reasons we just talked about, I would say in that big glut of teams that can say we're in the wild card picture, the Mets have as much talent on their roster as anyone. They obviously have flaws. They are very addressable flaws that they can fix at the trade deadline. So to do what they did and go from 11 games under 500 at the start of June to briefly over 500, and to be right there with every other team in the National League at this point, with less than half a season to go, I would say it's a disappointment if they don't make a run, if they don't make the playoffs. And it's really difficult to put a ceiling on teams when you make the playoffs. I truly believe that anything is possible once you do that. Baseball is a funny sport. You saw it last year with the Diamondbacks. You see it almost every year. And I think that Diamondbacks team is sort of a great instructive lesson for clubs. The Mets saw them at Citi Field in September of that year, last year, and they did not look like a very good team. The Mets looked like a clearly better team, and the Mets were long since out of it at that point. Lo and behold, of course, the Diamondbacks get hot at the right time. They go all the way to the World Series. So if a team like that can do it, certainly a team like the Mets that has some of the biggest stars in the game can do it, but it's not easy. You do have to go and play good baseball now for the next 3 months. The Mets have 1 good month and 2 bad months on their resume. If they can string together a couple more good ones, I really do think, well, certainly no one's going to put them as the favorites against teams like the Dodgers or the Phillies. They do have the capability to beat clubs like that and to make a run when push comes to shove.
I really just, as we kind of wrap things up here, want to almost, challenge you to see, maybe 5 years or 10 years into the future. What do you think could be the ceiling for this team, for obviously all of those fans who are so eager and hopeful for more winning?
Yeah, look, Steve Cohen has referred many times to the Dodgers as the model, a team that spends a lot of money but doesn't necessarily rely on that. They rely on their player development system, and that's what it comes down to when you start talking about 5-10 years in the future. And Cohen has owned the team for getting on about 5 years now. It always comes back to player development. Can you draft well? Can you develop well? Can you consistently bring players from the minor leagues to the major leagues and have them have success at this level? It's something that the Mets have done really poorly over the past 15 years or so, I would say. Yes, some players have come up and made impacts, but when you compare them to some of the elite franchises in baseball, it hasn't been that many. If they can change that, and if they can go and become one of those teams that is constantly pumping talent into the majors, and then you supplement that with an owner that can outspend anyone when it's appropriate to do so, that's when you create this type of juggernaut that you're in it every single year. You're expecting to make deep runs every single year. It's hard to do. I think when Steve Cohen, I think he would admit this when he bought the team, I think he thought it would be easier to just sort of transform that and create these inner systems where within a couple of years the Mets would be churning out talent like the Dodgers and other teams do. It hasn't happened yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen. I think Cohen has learned a lot over his 4 or 5 years owning this team, and I think there's still a lot of work to do, but I think he knows exactly what that is. And again, when you have resources like he does, it can paper over a lot of problems. So I do think if you're a Mets fan, you should be optimistic that 5, 10 years down the line, the Mets will have figured out that secret sauce. It's no guarantee that you're going to start winning World Series every year, but it is a guarantee, or at least close to it, that you're going to be in it and having interesting teams every year. And I think that's a reasonable goal for the Mets.
Well, that's great to hear. And just all of your insight on the team this year, as someone who's around them every day, is great as well. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it very much. Last kind of question here for you that's a little bit of a different topic, a little step back, but you co-wrote David Wright's book with him, The Captain. I'm 23, so I grew up on David Wright. He was my favorite Mets player and got me into the team and the organization. So I just want to take a minute and ask you about what that experience was like, and how he was really, both on and off the field, different than any guy who's ever walked through those doors for the Mets.
Yeah, it was a really interesting process and a fun process to sort of work with him on that book. I thought, to kind of pick his brain on things that maybe we had talked about when he was a player, maybe we hadn't, to kind of hear what he was thinking, and more than that, what he was feeling in certain moments through some of the highest highs of his career and some of the lowest lows. I thought was a fascinating insight into how the brain of an elite athlete works. And this is a guy who was on a Hall of Fame arc for a big chunk of his career. But it's funny. It's a player that I didn't cover his entire career, but I came up towards the beginning of it and developed a relationship with him, and always kind of had in the back of my mind that, especially once he started going through a bunch of adversity with the injuries to his back and other things, coming back, making it back to the field, having that emotional goodbye at Citi Field, like, it struck me along the way that it would make a good book. And now that, having done it, people ask me, oh, do you want to write another book? And the answer is kind of maybe. Yeah, probably at some point. But for me, it needs to be something that I think is interesting, that I'm passionate about. And that, to me, he was the perfect subject. He was gracious. He was obviously an interesting subject to write about. But working with him sort of only underscored all of the things that you hear about him, about what a good human being he is on top of it. So it made the whole process easy. It was fun doing it. And I'm glad that people have gotten some joy out of it.
Yeah, I know. I had that whole thing read cover to cover 2 days after it came
Well, I
out.
appreciate that.
It was great. And yeah, thank you so much for providing us some insight on that.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Seriously, thank you so much for for being here. We always say inside access, and you really were able to provide that. So thanks.
You got it. Thank you, guys. Happy to come on.
All right, guys, that's Anthony DiComo. So let's see your comments. Drop some comments in the comment section. We want to know what you thought about what you heard, and if there's any other questions who you have for any future guests that we might have. Good time to tell you again to follow us on all platforms. We're out here cooking on our Twitter, on our Instagram. You can find us on YouTube. It's the same handle everywhere, at YMetsPod. And until then, the Mets are back to 500, and we are hoping that it will be even better than that when we talk to you on Sunday.
See you next week.